Hi, my name is Cindy Rang with the Fabric Patch in Ephrata, Washington, and today we're going to talk about borders. Borders are critical to the completion of your quilt. People think that they made it through all of the blocks, made it through all of the piecing, maybe even all of the applique, and then it's smooth sailing after that, which is true. But if you don't put your borders on correctly, you can not ruin, but you can affect all of your hard work. I say that as a long arm quilter, somebody who, if you bring your quilt to me and you want me to finish it, we have to make sure that it absolutely lays flat. The other thing that will happen is sometimes you'll give a gift to somebody, a quilt, and you'll think that they're going to put it on the bed, and when you go over to their house, you find that it's hanging on the wall. So if it's hanging on the wall, but it's hanging a little skewed because the borders are on there funny, you're not going to like that. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the math involved with borders, so we're going to do a little bit of work on paper, and then we're also going to talk about color, because there's two reasons that we do borders. We do borders for color, to be able to either add more of the color that we want or downplay one of the other colors, or to use a focus piece of fabric that we have. The other reason that we use borders is we use borders because when we got our quilt finished, it wasn't the size that we thought it was, or it wasn't big enough. I've even made a queen size quilt for somebody only to find out that from the time I started it to the time I finished it, they now have a king size quilt, or king size bed. So I'll show you how to fix all of those things. The other thing I want to mention is that if you've been doing the row sampler class with us, this is actually class 12 of 14. We didn't label it that way in the YouTube description because we think that borders are just a universal knowledge that every quilter has to have, and we're not really talking as much about our rows today as we are our borders. So if you've been working on your row sampler, then sorry, I think I jiggled the camera when I did that. If you've been working on your row sampler, now would be the time if you feel like you want to make it bigger. Maybe you got your row sampler done and it's smaller than you thought, and you really want to make sure that it fits your bed. These are some options for you to be able to go ahead and make it bigger. So if there's a quilt that you're working on, sometimes that's what determines your your borders, is the fabric that you have left. So if you have a bunch of pieces left and maybe you were sparingly using this one because this one was your favorite one, well, now's the chance to go ahead and add it in a border, to feature it in something. And if you've learned a lot of different rows along the way, all of those rows can become borders. The other thing that you can do is if you just have a lot of weird little leftover pieces, there's some great things that you can do to use up those leftover pieces. And so I'm going to show you a couple different options. The other thing is, if you've watched any of our previous videos, you would know that I am really not a rules person. I kind of feel like there's a few rules that we have to follow in order to make sure that everything turns out great and as expected, but most of the time you just kind of need to have fun with it, and we can fix it in the end, and it's all going to be okay. When it comes to borders, there are two rules that we do need to discuss. One is that you have to measure your borders and pin them before you sew them on, and that's what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The other rule is that no border should be bigger than half the size of the block. If that doesn't make sense, I'm going to show you that as we go through. But if you've got a 12-inch block that you made, and let's say that you made only 20 blocks, so you have 4 across by 5 down, and you realize that that 12-inch block ended up making a quilt that's about 45 by 50, and you really needed it to be twin size. If you add a border that's 14 inches all the way around to get that quilt the size that you want, it's not going to look right. What's going to happen is it's going to look like you put this massive border on this quilt because you didn't make enough blocks, which is exactly what happened. And so what you have to do is you can add 14 inches worth of border, but you just have to break it up. So those are the two rules. Rule number 1, measure, pin, then sew. And rule number 2, no borders should be bigger than half the size of that pieced block. And again, we'll show that. So I think before we draw on the board, let's just do a little bit of show and tell. I just want to show you a couple of options. So I'm going to stand up for this. Okay, let's start with this one. So this is just a basic quilt, just an applique hand-stitched quilt. And you can see that this border really was not used within the quilt, which is okay. It kind of gave a nice frame to it. And also the size didn't matter so much because this is just a simple little throw quilt. It also could be one that hangs on the wall, but it's really just something to add a frame to it. And same idea. And again, I just want to show you that this one, the fabric was not used, I don't think, within the quilt, but you can see that it has enough to do with the rest of it that it's all okay. This is a pretty large border, but there's a lot going on in this fabric, and it's still only half the size of this block. So it's not massive. And you can imagine if this border were this big, it would just be overpowering and you wouldn't see as much of the cute quilt. This is a little pocket. It's kind of a cute little quilt. This one is borderless. So this one, this is called Diamond Candy. It's just a variation of our dumpster diving pattern. And so for this one, all I did was, it was all about these fabrics in here. So what I did is my border is just the same as my background. And even my binding is the same. So a lot of people think that there's a rule that you have to end with a dark border or a dark binding. You can decide for yourself. It's not necessarily a rule that I follow, but I do think sometimes it can look odd if you have a dark quilt and then suddenly you have kind of a pale border. It almost makes it look unfinished. So, you know, like you didn't outline it. So you can think about that. This particular one though, everything was light, so the binding made sense. So that's just an option. This one, this is a Momo fabric. So all it is a big piece of fabric that we loved. Let me get it right side up. It's pretty large, and what we started with was this piece of fabric, which is classic vintage. You can't find it anymore, but it's a Momo fabric. And we just wanted to make a quilt out of this fabric, this center piece. And we wanted to add a couple of borders to it. So this is just an example of every time we added this border, we measured, we knew exactly the size of that border. And if you look at this, as I hold this up, you can see this is a perfectly square, or it's rectangle, but I mean, there's no wow in the border when I hold it because everything was measured. And it's interesting enough because there's enough color going on. It's probably a little wild maybe, but there's enough stuff going on where we don't have just one great big huge 16-inch border, which might look a little odd. So instead we've got 2 inches, 4 inches, 2 inches, and I think that this one is 7. So we've got enough interest that you can see that there's added borders. And at the end, I'm gonna add some pictures. We used to do a class that we called, I think we called it Block Swappers. And what it was we all made blocks, brought things in, and then everybody added, we would trade, and everybody would add borders to our quilt. So I would have somebody's and have their bag of fabric, and I would add their border. I'd put everything back in the bag, and then when we came to class, we would trade again. No one would ever see it. And we would trade, somebody else would do a border, we would trade, somebody else would do a border. And then finally at the end of the 5 months or however long it took, we would all get our quilts back. So I have 3 or 4 of those. I'll add those pictures at the end and you'll be able to see how interesting it is when you can take something that's fairly small and then with all of these different borders, how you can turn something pretty large and make it extremely interesting because it's all about the borders. So I'll add those at the end and you can see those. This one was just a simple quilt that started out with just some 5-inch squares. So we sewed, how many are there? Probably about 40 together in the inside and then put a border on. Sewed more together and then put a border on. Sewed more together and then put a border on. So again, you can keep doing this as much as you'd like to, as long as you're measuring everything and everything is the right size to make sure that your quilt is square when you're done with it. This quilt, we're doing a second video today that should load right after this one. That is Quilt Smart. We kind of felt that it needed to be a separate class because it's a little bit involved and it's about 20 minutes. But we want to show you how you can take a fusible product, super simple, and just iron on a border. And that's what this is. So we're going to show you how to do this. So this same thing, this is just a really cool fabric that we just like. This is just one piece of fabric. And then we pieced a border here. And then this is that Quilt Smart. This would be very difficult to piece. There's all sorts of things that would be involved in that, but instead what we did is we just used an iron-on interfacing and laid it down, fused it down. So super simple, and we're going to show you how this works. So if you want something that's a little bit fancier and more colors and a little easier, this is an option. So we'll show you that process. And then the last one that I want to show you, we'll talk about, is this piano key. There's a couple, this was the example of the queen size quilt that then had to become king size. So I had to come up with a total of 42 inches worth of border after the quilt was made. So this is the star stepping quilt. So this is the quilt, and you can see 42 inches worth of borders. So that meant 21 inches on one side, 21 inches on the other. And the block size, even on point, the blocks aren't that big. So as long as I did, this is a 2.5 inch border, this is 10 inches. And this is pretty large for a border, but because there's a lot going on, again, like we showed in that colorful one, you can get away with a little bit bigger because there's a lot to look at. And then this is a 4 inch and this is a 4 inch. And so, but there wasn't anything else that we could do short of making more blocks. And again, that's what you want to think about, is that if your quilt is too small because you didn't make enough blocks, you either need to be very creative with your borders or make more blocks. If you don't have any fabric left out of what you've been doing, then it's possible that making more blocks is really not the option. All right, so what we're going to do, the other thing we want to do is we want to show you how to measure a bed. And so we're going to go to one of the retreat rooms and we're going to show you how to measure a bed. We've come out to our event center and retreat center to go ahead and measure a bed. We thought we would just give you a quick little tour of one of the condos. This one is actually condo number 1. All of them are designed the same. They all are 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom. You can find more information on our website at www.fabricpatch.net and just look for the Gate 17 tab. And let's see, Rhonda, I'm going to get you in it. Boom! Bye! Sorry. That was Rhonda, our photographer. And so, anyway, and this is the other bedroom. and no light on in there, but the other bathroom, washer dryer behind that door. So we're gonna measure this bed. Okay, so ideally when you measure a bed, you have to have a 120-inch tape measure, and you should have a second person with you. You don't really have to, but what's nice is if you have a second person, what you're gonna do is toss them the end, and then you stand on this side, and then you can tell them where you want the tape to go. You can say, oh, I want to go down to the bottom of the bed frame, I want to go all the way down to the floor, I want to go to the bottom of the mattress because I have a dust ruffle. Whatever it is that you have them hold the tape on that side, and on this side, you hold the tape so that you can hold on to that and say, okay, what I need is 80 inches. And so you know exactly what the measurement is because you know that they're holding it in the same place. If for some reason you don't have a second person, of course you can position where you think you want it, go over, position it, come back and do the same thing. So then you have your width. For your length, you have to make a couple decisions. So again, you have your nice long tape measure. You have to decide what you like. I tend to like to just have my quilt finished because I like to have pillows. I just like pillows. But if you want to have a pillow tuck, you're just going to want to figure that out. So bring that up. How much room do you need for your pillow tuck, and figure that in. Once you have that, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to come down, same thing, to the end or whatever it is, the end of your frame or wherever you were, so that you know that measurement, which on this one is 106. So make that decision. I, again, tend to start at the edge of the pillow. It's too many blankets up here for me when I have my quilt as a pillow tuck. And then I come down, and sure enough, then I'm at 84. So that's how you measure a bed. Every bed is different. You can think that it's just a twin bed, but does it have that pillow top? Does it have a thick mattress? Is it high off the ground? What kind of a box spring does it have? So it is best, if you know what bed you're making your quilt for, to go ahead and measure it. Okay, so now that you know how to measure your bed, we'll know what your finished quilt size needs to be. But let's back up for just a minute and let's talk about just a basic border on a basic quilt, and it doesn't matter. And this tends to be kind of dry, but it's very important that you understand this process. You won't like your results if you don't do it this way. And that's why we're just going to do it kind of on paper and pencil, or in this case, dry erase board, because it's super important. Because there are a couple videos out there, and even somebody that I really respect that has done a ton of them, and she just takes these borders and she lays her border on her quilt, sews it down, cuts it off, sews on the next one, cuts it off, sews on the next one, cuts it off. You do not want to do that, and I'm going to show you why. So let's just say that your quilt is whatever it is, and it kind of doesn't matter. So let's say that here's your quilt, and it doesn't have to be any specific size for your bed. Let's just say life is good the way that it is. You're going to throw it on your couch, and all you're going to do is add one little border, just like that first snowman quilt that I showed you. So let's say that your quilt is 60 by 70, and you just want to put on a 4-inch border. Well, what you need to do is you need to take your extra long, your 120-inch tape measure that we've already talked about, and you need to measure your quilt. So if you measure across the top, and let's say that we actually do get 60 inches, also measure across the bottom. What if across the bottom you get, well, what's a 5 backwards? Is that right? 50. Writing upside down is, you know, it's all my years in the medical field and explaining lab levels to patients. But anyway, so the top of your quilt is 60 inches, the bottom is 59. And on this side, and that's normal. If you're within an inch, that's good. Don't feel like that's bad. That's fine. And then let's say on this side of your quilt is 70 inches because we've measured with our long tape measure. And let's say that on this side, let's say that it's 71. Again, perfectly normal. That's what's going to happen. So what will happen is if you just decide to sew on borders, so let's say that you have all of these strips, you've sewn all of these together, and you're going to sew this on and cut it off. Sew on the next one, cut it off. Sew on the next one, cut it off. And you're just going to keep going. Well, what will happen is if we look at kind of an exaggerated view, this top is longer and this side is longer than this side and this side. So we've already got kind of this little wow in the top. So if you keep adding borders on, it's going to grow with every border you add. This happens every time. There was a quilt that I got to quilt for somebody that they brought in for me to quilt. She had 6 borders on it. I could not get that thing to load on the long arm machine at all, because when you load it on the long arm, what's happening is we pin across the top and we pin across the bottom. So if I pin this straight and I've got all of this and I pin this straight, this is never going to lay flat, right? It's just going to do that, and that's exactly what happened. So the long arm quilter cannot quilt that out. There's nothing we can do except put darts and pleats, and it's not a good thing. No one is happy with it. The tension doesn't, you can't get your tension correct when you're quilting, so it makes it a big, huge problem. This one quilt that this gal had brought for me, she had 6 borders on it. And I said to her, I'm going to have to give the quilt back to you. I can't even put it on my machine. And she says, oh, never mind. I'm just going to, throw it away. It doesn't matter. And I couldn't bear that. And I said, let me just take it apart for you. I'm just going to do it for you. So I took the borders off. I had measured. And when I was finished, after I'd taken everything off, I have to think about this for a minute. The 3rd border was off by 6 inches. The 6th border was off by 9 inches. That's how big of a difference there was by the time we had measured. This side was 9 inches bigger, just because all she did is she just went around, 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 and sewed them on. So do not do this. Even if you just do one time, your quilt is not going to lay flat. If somebody hangs it on the wall, it's not going to hang straight. So what you do, so we've measured, let's go back to this. So we've measured and we have 60 inches on the top, 59 inches on the bottom. So what we're going to do, let me erase my little goofy borders that I put on here. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure. And so, So we're going to measure, and if I have 60 inches here, I need 60 inches here. So what I'm going to do is when I prepare my borders, I go ahead and I take my strips. So I think we decided we were going to do 4 inches, right? So I have a 4-inch strip, and I'm going to sew that to another 4-inch strip, and sew that to another 4-inch strip. And people will ask, do you sew straight across or do you sew diagonal? I would tell you that I do tend to sew diagonal, and you know what I mean by that is when you take your 2 strips and you sew them like this so that when they lay flat, you've got that diagonal seam. The reason that I do that is because I have less bulk in that seam, and the other reason is that it seems to, if you've got a printed border, it seems to disappear a little bit more. But some people will tell you that that's a rule. It's not a rule. Decide for yourself. If you find those diagonal borders are either taking up too much fabric, which it will, if you have very little fabric left, you're going to take up a whole lot more on a diagonal border than you will a straight border, a straight seam, diagonal seam, straight seam. So decide for yourself what works best for you, but not a rule. So, but if I have my borders, my strips sewn together, so I have these long strip, what I'm going to do is I've cut off all of my salvage, of course, and I'm going to fold this over right sides together, and I'm going to cut my top border and my bottom border at the exact same time, so they are identical. So I'm going to fold this over right sides together. So let's pretend that that's what I've done here. My fold's right here. Here's my edge. I'm going to measure my 60 inches and I'm going to cut it. So I have my two pieces. So I might have and of course, since I only have a 42-inch length, I have a couple seams in there, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference. So I know that I have two pieces here that are exactly 60 inches. And people will say, well, why do you pick the bigger number rather than the smaller number? And there's a reason for that. This 60 inch, it's going to fit perfectly. And that 59, I can probably smooth out and eke out an extra inch without any trouble at all. I don't have to pull anything. I don't have to stretch anything. It's amazing that you can find it in there, but you absolutely can. It's not going to put any stress on that quilt at all to get this edge 60 inches. But if I did 59, to get 60 inches into 59, what's going to happen is you're going to have a little pucker. So you don't really want that little pucker in there because the pucker is kind of hard to hide. So I always go with the bigger number. So I take my 60-inch border, I'm going to lay that down, and you pin it. You go ahead and you take your pins. I'm just going to grab these for a second. You can use pins or you can use binder clips. I like binder clips. I use them all the time, but sometimes you might need more than what you have. And if you have pins, why can I not get these open? You do want to make sure that you have the longer pins. Quilting pins are different than sewing pins. They tend to be 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches long so that you can go through everything. But you have to pin it. I tend to be somebody, I think I've talked in previous videos that I don't do a lot of pinning. I press a lot, but pinning, I can usually hold it where I need to hold it. For borders, I pin or wonder clip 100% of the time. Always, always, always. And what I do is I put a pin in the end and I put a pin in the other end because it has to end up perfect. That's that whole idea, is that I cut exactly 60 inches. So I want to make sure that it stays 60 inches. So I pin it one end and the other end, and then I fold it and I pin it in the middle. And then depending upon how long my border is, I might put 2 more pins or 3 more pins or 1 more, whatever, but I'll put some in the middle. I do the same thing at the bottom. I'm going to take my 60-inch strip, I'm going to pin right at one end, bring it down, and pin it at that other end so that that 59-inch border is bottom is going to be 60 inches. I'm going to pin it in the center and maybe a couple more pins. And again, you will be amazed. You easily can turn that into 60 inches. Now, the top of my quilt and the bottom of my quilt is exactly the same size. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this side. Now, since I've added 4 inches here, this number has already changed. So let's just say that this is 79 inches and this is 78 inches. You do exactly the same thing. I've sewn my borders. I'm going to sew a couple more strips on here so I have enough. Make it as long as I need to. Obviously, it needs to be about, 160 inches in length at least to start with. So I'm going to do that. Fold it over, right sides together, wrong sides together, doesn't matter. I just need to cut 2 at exactly the same time. And I'm going to cut 2 strips that are 79 inches. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to pin the end, pin the other end, find the center. And it is important that you find the center. And in fact, I should have said this. I find the center before I pin it. I take my strip, I fold it in half and put a pin in it. And then I take my quilt, fold my quilt in half and put a pin in it. So I'm actually lining up. I'm taking my border with my pin in it, and I take my quilt with my pin in it, and I line those up. So I should have been clear about that. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. This is my 79-inch strip. I'm going to pin the end, pin the other end, line up my 2 pins and pin it in the center. And then it's real easy after that to go ahead and put 2, 3, 4 more pins in it, whatever you need. And again, you won't even notice the fact that you have somehow because it sounds horrible to think that you're stretching your quilt. But gosh, I mean, we've had some, horrible incidents where we maybe even had to come up with 1.5 inches to be able to make this quilt square, and we've not had any trouble with that. But this is important with every border you add. So after you've added this 4-inch border, let's say now you've decided you got the quilt done and it's so dang cute, you do want to put it on your queen size bed. Now you found out that you need to add 14 more inches in borders. And so again, what will happen is if we have our quilt, we have our 4-inch border, you might decide then you're going to do some little pop of color, and you're going to do a little 2-inch border, and then you're going to do another 4-inch border. Whatever you're going to add, you need to decide what you're going to do. But each time, each border that you add, each color that you add, you measure every single time. Every single time. It takes minutes. It takes a couple of minutes to take your little long tape measure, measure that piece, pin it, cut it, but it is all the difference in the world to make sure that your quilt is flat and the way that you're going to finish it. And even if you know that you're going to tie it, or you're going to machine quilt it, or yourself, or stitch in the ditch, or whatever you're going to do, you still want this quilt to drape on your bed perfectly. You want to fold it up and know that it folds up square. So this kind of a thing, not attractive. We don't like that. All right. Okay, so let's see. One other thing. So this was important. Oh, sorry. Oh, I don't even know what happened. It was an earthquake. Let's say that we have a quilt that is 60 inches by 70 inches. And we have made a bunch of half square triangles that look like this. And all of them are 5 inches. So if they're all 5 inches, and by that 5 inches finished, which is a whole nother thing. If this is a 5.5 inch block, when I sew it using my 1/4 inch seam all the way around, it's going to finish at 5 inches, right? So I've started with 5.5 inch blocks. It will finish at 5 inches. And that's what is important to know, is that it's the finished size. So I know that 60 is divisible by 5, and 70 is divisible by 5. So what I could do is I could put 14 of these 5-inch blocks on this side. I can put 14 on this side. Is that right? 7, yeah. And I can put 12 on this side and 12 on this side. So once I've sewn those together, 12 times 5, I'm sure that's right. 12 times 5 is 60 inches. 12 times 5 is 60 inches. 14 times 5 is 70. And then in the corner, I'll just put 1, right? Because this is 5 inches, this is 5 inches, so I'll put another one right here, another one right there, another one right there, and another one right there. So when you sew this together, of course, you've got your top row, which is actually going to be 14 of them, your bottom row, which is your 12, your 1 and your 1, same thing up here, and you're going to sew this row to here. So you can do that if you have a block that you've made, you have a whole bunch of leftovers, you have some squares, you have a charm pack, something else that you've used and you want to put those squares in there. It's an easy way to make sure that it will fit, or to find out if it will fit. Now, the other thing that you can do, what if it's not divisible? You just have to make it divisible. Does that make sense? So let's say that your quilt is 56 by, I don't know, 67. I don't think anything is divisible by those two numbers. And so what you have to do is you just have to add borders. So just like we've talked about coping strips before, you put coping strips on your quilt to get it up to the size that you need. So again, we have these blocks over here that are 5.5 inches that are going to finish at 5 inches. So we need to have two numbers that are divisible by 5. So we need this to be 60, and we need this number to be 70. So all I need to do is I need to end up with 2 inches. So I'll cut, well, yeah, because I need 4 inches. So I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch strip for this side, or a border, and one for this side. So if I've added 2 inches there and 2 inches there, I now have 60. And then the same thing, I only need 3 inches here. So I'll have 1.5 inches down here and 1.5 inches here. Now that's going to worry people because you're going to think, well, I've got 2 inches, 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 1.5 inches. You will not see that. Your eye will absolutely correct that. No one will look at that quilt from afar and go, oh my gosh, what is the craziness with that border? No one will see that. And in fact, at the end, I'm going to throw some other pictures in there of some other finished quilts, and I'll point out to you the ones that have these odd borders that we added that were coping borders to get up to a size so that we could put whatever pieced border we want. Because again, if we have a quilt that is 56 by 68, but we need it to be 80 by, what was our number, 94, we have to add a bunch of stuff. So we could add a little colorful border here, we could add our half square triangles here, and even at that, so now we're still only at 60 by 70, so we need another 14 inches, right, to get to our 94, and up here we need another 20 inches to get to our 80. So you just have to keep in mind then that that means I'm going to need another 10 inches on this side, another 10 inches on this side, and I'm going to need 7 inches at the bottom and 7 inches at the top. You can do that however you want to. I might do something as simple as putting a 3-inch little side piece on both sides. So now I'm dealing with 7 inches of border. And depending upon what's on the inside, you know, again, if I've got some 10-inch blocks in here, I would never do one border that was 7 inches. You could go ahead and take that same 7 inches and you could do a 2-inch border, and then you could do a 3-inch border, and then another 2-inch border. You might still end up with that 7 inches, but there's enough going on that it doesn't look like you just had to add more fabric. It really looks like you planned things out and went through a lot of work to add all of those extra borders. So again, sometimes it's nice to see it visually and to have just to see how that looks and see that it doesn't look weird. And so I'm going to add a bunch of pictures. So hopefully this all made sense, and hopefully what will do is be able to get your quilt to the size you want it to be. Oftentimes it doesn't matter, we just add a border, and I have made so many quilts that they're all over the place. They're on the foot of every bed, they're in multiple different armoires, they're on the couch, they're seasonal, it kind of doesn't matter. But if you're making a quilt for a bed, it's important that it fit that bed properly. And again, every once in a while, whatever you've pieced in the inside, it's just not quite big enough to fit that specific bed. So it's nice to know how to add color, add design, add extra borders to be able to get it the size that you want, and to put those borders on accurately so that you don't have this weird wonky thing when you're done. And your long arm quilter will thank you for that. So all right, well, thanks for joining us for our border talk, and I hope that was helpful. And be sure and check out a lot of these quilt patterns we've put on our website. You'll be able to find them there at www.fabricpatch.net.